Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning for those of you who are joining us from the East or the West. Good afternoon. Zoom enables us to have global yet focused conversations. We are in the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan, and it is the time of the month that is the most intensive of religious activity. And in fact, this evening's program, or today's program, is leading up to what is called Laylatul Qadr, and by most or many Sunni traditions, Laylatul Qadr is marked this evening, the 27th of the month of Ramadan. The Quran describes Laylatul Qadr as greater than 1,000 nights, and intimates that this is the beginning of God's direct communication with the people that become the Muslim people. And according to the Quran, the most complete message of God's revelation to humanity that begins all the way back to Adam. This is a great time to talk about God in our lives. Jews and Muslims, we have a rich and varied set of traditions about God and talking with God. Whether it's Sufi traditions who think about conversations with God as a kind of friendship, an intimate conversation that you aspire to connect to God in a very personal, deep way. Bratslav Hasidim in the Jewish tradition walk alone in the forest, talking to God like a friend as well, but this time talking, crying, and even yelling at God. Our prophets describe many different kinds of conversations with God, awake, in dreams, and even rarely face to face. Sometimes conversations with God can sound like thunder, and sometimes it can be a still small voice. And sometimes it can happen as a conversation on Zoom between two good friends. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our discussion partners for this evening, and then I will sit back and listen as well. At the end of the conversation, we will take some questions, and as my colleague Doron has written, if you would write your questions in the chat box, then we will be able to conduct the question and answer period in a graceful way. I want to introduce first Imam Abdullah Antepli. He is a senior fellow on Jewish-Muslim relations at the Shalom Hartman Institute and co-director of the Muslim Leadership Initiative. He is on faculty at both Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy and Duke Divinity School, where from 2008 to 2014, he served as the university's first Muslim chaplain, one of only a handful of full-time Muslim chaplains at US colleges and universities. He was recently recognized as one of the most influential Muslims in US higher education by the nonprofit Times. In his multiple roles at Duke, Imam Abdullah engages students, faculty, staff, across and beyond campus through seminars, panels, and other avenues to provide Muslim voices and perspectives to the discussions of faith, spirituality, social justice, and more. Imam Antepli also serves as a faculty member in the Duke Divinity School, teaching courses on Islam and Muslim cultures. From 1996 to 2003, Imam Abdullah worked on a variety of faith-based humanitarian and relief projects in Myanmar and Malaysia, with the Association of Social and Economic Solidarity with Pacific Countries. He then served as the first Muslim chaplain at Wesleyan University, and subsequently as the Associate Director of the Islamic Chaplaincy Program and Interfaith Relations, and an adjunct faculty member at the Hartford Seminary in Connecticut. And that is where I had the honor of meeting Imam Abdullah many years ago. Our second conversation partner is Yossi Klein Halevi, who is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah of the University and Meital Friedman of the Hartman Institute, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Over 100 Muslim leaders have participated in this unique program. Halevi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller. He writes for leading op-ed pages in North America, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times. He is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. He is frequently quoted on Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish affairs in leading media around the world, and is one of the best-known lecturers on Israeli issues in the American Jewish community and on North American campuses. Born in Brooklyn, he received his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and his MS in journalism from Northwestern University. Halevi moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who helps direct the Center for Jewish Meditation, and they have 3 children. I hand it over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Raquel. Pleasure and honor was mine to meet you almost a decade and a half ago in Connecticut, and I'm glad our paths crossed here as well.
So, Abdullah, let's begin first of all with Ramadan Kareem.
Thank you so very much. Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Saeed to all of you. And as Raquel mentioned, today is Laylatul Qadr, which usually you spend the most of your time at the mosque reading Quran overnight. But now we are trying to make sense of this unusual Ramadan with unusual practices. So climax of Ramadan, which is today, we try to make sense of it, put more meaning into it through these online means. And I'm glad to share this brief window of Laylatul Qadr with my brothers and sisters around the globe, especially in the Holy Land.
So, Abdullah, maybe we'll begin with how we met, because I think it's relevant to the and in 2001, I published a book called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, which was an account of a journey that I took into Palestinian society, the West Bank, Gaza, into parts of Israeli Arab society as well. And this was a pilgrimage into Islam and Christianity, into the faiths of my neighbors. And I spent a year immersed in Muslim spirituality, especially in Sufi communities, which is really where I was most welcome. And I had the privilege of being admitted into the Muslim prayer line on a number of occasions, and certainly rituals. And I published the book, and it came out at a particularly inauspicious moment. September 11th, 2001 was the pub date. And I was in Manhattan that morning because we were planning to have a launch for the book that evening in Manhattan. Needless to say, the launch never happened, and to a large extent, the book never happened either. And the truth is that the morning after 9/11, Americans were not interested in reading about the adventures of a religious Israeli Jew in mosques and monasteries. This was actually the last thing that anyone in America was interested in at the moment.
Our God is God of irony.
A God of irony. And so the book really faded away very quickly. Abdullah, I don't know if I ever told you this story, but I was at my publisher's office that morning, and the president of the company comes up to me He just lays his hand on my shoulder and says, "I'm sorry." I didn't fully internalize. He obviously understood what this meant in terms of publishing. I had not yet internalized what this meant for the book. But very quickly, I realized that this book was over before it really began. And the truth is that part of me was relieved, because meanwhile, and Israelis on the call will appreciate this, meanwhile, we were a full year into the second Intifada, the worst wave of suicide bombings in our history. And I really felt emotionally distanced from this journey that I took into Islam. And so the book comes out on that inauspicious date with the background of 9/11, of the second Intifada. And I basically buried the book emotionally, and I moved on to another project. About a year later, Abdullah?
Yep, 2002.
A year later, I get an email from someone who I did not know, with a name I could not at that time pronounce. And he informs me that he is a Turkish-born imam and the Muslim chaplain at that time at Wesleyan. And he wrote to me that I read your book, and you know the writer's joke, "Oh, you're the one." And in this case, it wasn't far from the truth. And he said, "I was deeply moved by your journey, and I want to undertake a reciprocal journey into Judaism." Abdullah, why don't you take the story from here?
Well, this encounter with a religious Jew, which really changed my life and enriched my life, was part of an ongoing broad journey of mine. Innately, from early young age, I've been fascinated by any kind of difference. Anybody who's different than me fascinates me, fills me with a lot of curiosity, genuine curiosity to understand. And what I'm about to say is not a statement or a judgment on other faith traditions. This curiosity led me to an avid interfaith worker, student. I have multiple degrees from Christian seminaries. I have a degree on Christian-Muslim relations. I lived in Myanmar, Burma, very religious Buddhist country. And I've extensively traveled into India, Hinduism, etc. But all other religions, in those religious spaces, in religious education, I was always a respectful observer, a student. Only in the Jewish spaces, especially in the last couple of years, I feel right at home. I feel incredibly at home. I am no longer just an external observer. I can get into my deep Muslim space and evoke God's name in a completely Jewish place and Jewish language, in Hebrew, in a synagogue, in a Shabbat service, in a Shavuot Torah reading. I can be, as a Muslim imam, practicing Muslim, a lover of Allah, trying to engage with in a completely Jewish space. In other Jewish religious spaces, I'm an external observant, respectful observant. And Yossi Klein Halevi and my friendship with him is an incredible contributor to this Muslim man's efforts to indigenize himself in Jewish spaces. But more importantly, I think that's the topic of our talk, my deep belief of God, my deep belief of the Jewish language, Jewish understanding of God and the Muslim language of God. In so many ways, they are not only similar, very familiar language, but also with striking differences, which made me believe, I absolutely believe that Jews and Muslims worship the same God. They adore, glorify the same Hashem. And it's amazing. The word Hashem, Adonai Eloheinu, evokes the similar feeling that Allah, Rabb, Rahman evokes in my space as well. But at the same time, God's manifestation in our lives, divine's manifestation in our lives are so different, so radically, sometimes contradictory different. There is an ambivalence in this divine that I hope we will talk a little bit more about it. Going back to that journey that my Rebbe, my teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, I was so deeply moved how a religious Jew can make an incredible spiritual pilgrimage journey into the heart of Islam and develop incredible amount of knowledge, appreciation, but also reverence, respect. His spiritual place in Muslim spaces, especially during 5 daily prayers, his ability to honor that space without compromising who he is, to me is an incredible success in interfaith relationships or cross-faith encounters. To me, the measure of success is not only as you try to understand somebody's other faith tradition, you develop so much knowledge and appreciation, but somehow that encounter with the other, religious other, turns into a mirror, that you see yourself in it, that you start growing in your own faith tradition. And I just couldn't help it with the previous background and curiosity and previous life that I had vis-a-vis Jews, Judaism, Zionism, and Israel, which was a very complicated picture, that I wanted to reciprocate. But as Yossi alluded, 9/11, Second Intifada, endless suicide bombings and terrorism in the Holy Land, he wasn't interested. He was a very difficult date. Quite honestly, it took 10 years to convince his heart that this is what we are called to do. Maybe our different understandings of God are different pieces of the same puzzle. Maybe not in addition to the voice from Sinai is calling us to solve Jewish-Muslim relations problem, but further glorify God's name. We have an opportunity here that our commitment to this relationship with God is inviting us to be in a better relationship, to move our communities in a different direction. So after 10 years of convincing and him moving to Shalom Hartman Institute, we were able to reconnect and partner in a much more stronger way with the Muslim Leadership Initiative program that we are running right now. I don't know if Yossi would like to say a little bit more about that.
Well, where I'd like to jump in, Abdullah, is in responding what you said earlier about the respect and reverence that I felt for Islam. I would say more strongly, I fell in love with the devotional heart of Islam. I fell in love with the way that Muslims revere God. And I've always felt that the last 200 years have not been kind to the God of Israel. My understanding of the heart of Judaism is that it is a story about it's a love affair, a very tumultuous love affair between God and a people. There are times, and we see this throughout the biblical account, where God will accuse the Jewish people of infidelity. There are times in Jewish history, especially after the Holocaust and other persecutions, where Jews would accuse God of faithlessness. But the essence of the story was always this love affair. And the last 200 years has not been good for this love affair, for all kinds of reasons. Combination of modernity and the secularizing movements and the Holocaust and our experience in America, in Israel. And so for all these reasons, the presence of God, even within religious spaces, even in many Orthodox spaces, I grew up Orthodox, I always felt a sense of spiritual depletion. And I felt that Judaism is about many things that are essential and beautiful, but God somehow didn't seem to be really one of them. There are exceptions. There are some groups within Judaism that tend to be a little more peripheral. Thinking of Breslev, really place the relationship with God. But what I loved in the mosque was that sense of total immersion, physical immersion, the body surrendering literally, metaphorically to God. I loved what was happening on that little prayer mat, the little space of the prayer mat. For my 50th birthday, my wife Sarah bought me a prayer mat, and it's one of my precious possessions. And sometimes I'll sit on the prayer mat and put on tefillin in the morning. And there's that sense that I felt in the Muslim relationship to God, which was total surrender. Now, I appreciate deeply the Jewish struggle with God, and Jews rightly pride ourselves on questioning and restlessness. You know, Jacob becomes Israel through an act of wrestling with the angel. And in that transformation is really built into our DNA a sense of struggling with the divine, with holiness. We value questions as much as answers, maybe more sometimes. Um, but I also came to envy the Muslim ability to surrender before God and to just say, you know, I'm just a human being. And whatever brilliant questions Talmudists can come up with, our philosophers can come up with, they are products of a finite consciousness. And there's something in your ability, and I mean this, you, Islam, but also you personally, Abdullah, that I've learned from you over the years, that sense of being able to just take all of your questions, and I know you have questions. You have as many questions as I do. You wrestle as well. But when you're on the prayer mat, those questions disappear, and it's you in front of God. And the question that I have for you, Abdullah, is when you prostrate before God, who is God at that moment? What is it? God the Father, God the King? Is it God who loves you? Is it God the omnipotent? Are you in awe? Are you afraid? Are you in love? What are you feeling? I know that I imagine you go in and out of different emotions, but you give us a little map of what's
Thank you.
happening.
I would love to hear your answer to this question as well. It's all of the above, but if I have to explain on one foot like Rabbi Hillel, in that moment when I put my face on the floor, God is an angry but loving mother that you rush to over and over, even though you've made mistakes, you have not been always source of pride, but with a sense of assurance, with a sense of contentment that yes, you have gone to the streets, dirtied yourself, made all sorts of mistakes. You rush back to the rahmah, to the mercy, to the compassion, the ultimate, endless, unconditional love and forgiveness of God Almighty. You come with a sense of accountability. It's not all, you are not aware of your wrongdoings and mistakes or your moral responsibilities, your moral duties, your moral imperatives. But you rush to God, not an angry, punishing person or an abusive parent, but you rush to God with a sense of guilt, a sense of forgiveness that you are asking, but with certain level of contentment and assurance that in her Shekinah, in her divine presence, you will find answers to those questions. You will find empowerment, inspiration to complete your repeated mistakes or wrongdoings or soft spots, etc. One of the beautiful stories from the life of Prophet Muhammad, when he was sitting on top of a roof and overseeing a marketplace, he saw a mother frantically screaming and looking for her child. And Prophet Muhammad immediately pointed out to that mother and says to his companions, watch this woman. She goes from shop to shop, corner to corner, crying, screaming her child's name. And finally she finds her son and completely envelopes her with tears. And Prophet Muhammad says, do you think this woman would ever throw her son into a hellfire or a fire, burn? Of course, the companion said, absolutely not. God's love, mercy, and compassion and attachment to all of you, as all of God's creation, is much, much greater than mother's mercy and compassion and love to her children. So when I'm in that moment on my face on the floor, I try to immerse and over the years through many different spiritual practices, including Ramadan and fasting, I want to connect to that feminine energy, that rahmah, that rahim.
So, you know, Abdullah, when you say, would God, would this mother throw her child into the fire? as a son of a Holocaust survivor, my instinctive response to that is, well, God actually did throw us into the fire, or allow us to be thrown into the fire. And there's no question that that colors a Jewish relationship with God today. And so when I think about God's mercy, and I believe deeply in God's mercy, I believe that ultimately everything in this world will be revealed, however improbably that seems today, as having been good. I believe that, but I don't always feel that. And the God that I relate to, well, I'll say first of all, I don't pray very much in a formal sense. I find the Jewish prayers to be a little cumbersome, mostly. There are a few that I like, a few that I'm connected to. But we're a very wordy people. We love words. And sometimes I make my living out of words, so I don't begrudge that entirely. But we don't know when to stop sometimes. And I do feel, in Islam, you really have a few very choice words of prayer. And I love that. So I do choose a few of the essential prayers that really speak to me.
Mhm.
But I would say that I encounter God most deeply in two other ways. The first is meditation, and I practice a form of meditation that comes through the Kabbalah. My wife Sarah and I are part of a meditation center here in Bat Elyon, here in Jerusalem, and we work with Jewish meditation tools. And the purpose of Jewish meditation is very different from mindfulness and very different from Zen. The purpose is to really experience God's presence. The premise of Kabbalistic meditation is that in the stillness, in the silence, you enter into the mind of God. And that is the goal of contemplative meditation in all of its forms. There's Christian contemplative meditation, the Hindu tradition. And I think the Sufi tradition, do you have strong meditation practice? I know the chanting. Do you have
Absolutely.
silence?
Absolutely. There are so many different orders, as you know, within the school of mystical Islam, and some of them are silent. Naqshbandi order, which is the majority, I think the majority of the Sufis in the world, they mostly do their practices silently. It's all activating your heart, activating your soul. It's all about seeing things through the eyes of the heart, not the flesh. Smelling things through the nose of the heart, not the flesh. Hearing things through the ears of the heart, but not the flesh.
So the way that I most intimately encounter God is through silence, is through these guided visualizations of the name of God, of certain ideas that bring you within what Kabbalah would call the structure of energy emanations of God. And through what Rabbi Nachman of Breslev called the constant conversation, that you, throughout your day, you maintain silently in your mind, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, in a running conversation with God. And in that sense, God is your companion. God is your friend. He's with you. And so, but I would say though, Abdullah, that the aspect of God that I most connect to is something that I think might sound very foreign to Muslim sensibilities. And that is the notion of an aspect of God that is in a state of evolving, becoming, state of evolution through human beings. I think that God, this aspect of God evolves through all kinds of ways, but one of the ways is through our growth. And each human being is a kind of a cell in this aspect of God. Now, in some ways, that sounds suspiciously like process theology, but it's in Kabbalah it plays out very differently, because and I would say for two reasons. The first is because in process theology, the God of becoming is basically all that there is. God is becoming. And in Kabbalah, it's just one aspect of God that's becoming. And there is the far more, what we traditionally think of God as God, the eternal, the Ein Sof, the non-changing. And that is really God in the highest. And God created an aspect of itself, which we call the Borei Olam, the creator, the master of the universe, in whom we live and evolve. And the second reason why I would say this is not conventional process theology is because Kabbalah is very clear that from our perspective, this aspect of God that is becoming, the aspect of creator aspect, is so beyond anything that we can conceive that it is perfect and omnipotent. And whatever it means that this aspect of God is evolving is really irrelevant for our lives and our understanding. So whatever relationship we have to Borei Olam, to the creator, is as if we're talking about really the unchanging eternal.
Maybe a different perspective, but the same concept. As you know, Muslims they wouldn't come close to say anything like God is evolving. God is perfect. God is complete. God is supreme. Maybe what's evolving is God's manifestation in God's creation, and also human beings' ability to receive that aspect of God, that manifestation of the divine in their life. That evolves and that changes. Both of our traditions goes out of its way how the finite, limited human capacity in understanding divine wisdom, because we haven't seen the entire movie yet. It will be revealed to us when we reunite with our Lord, and we don't know what is difficult, completely painful, or horrible today, what will eventually mean within the broad and big picture of life. As you know, this is a standard Muslim, which is still my commitment. But this picture only shattered, as you alluded, when I visited Auschwitz. That's where God has God's wisdom. God creates eventual blessings out of evil things. Over tragedies, humanity learns and grows. When I was in Auschwitz and when I encountered with Shoah in the immediate direct sense, there is a tradition which appears both in Talmud and the Quran. When God decides to create humanity, angels in the Muslim tradition revolts, protests very respectfully. Like before human beings were created, angels were with no free will, constantly glorifying God and worshiping God. And angels, by the knowledge that's been given to them, said to God, like, are you sure? Why would you want to create human beings? They will do terrible things. And those angels must have seen Shoah, must have seen to them between 1938 to 45. That's why they revolted God. But still, and the God responds, I know what you do not know. I want to understand in the more respectful, maybe more submissive to some Jewish ears and eyes, more surrendering way. What did God knew that we didn't know? And maybe more critical, more wrestling, more restless language of Judaism. And in so many ways, it's interesting that we were attracted to what seemed to be missing in our tradition. You were fascinated by the total surrender, and you were somewhat put off by the too much wrestling, too much discontentment in the Jewish tradition. And for any Jew, not being able to talk about God always puzzles me, especially in religious spaces. And for a lot of Muslims, how can you be a Jew even if you don't believe in God? Is a whole different mystery. I don't want to go there. But in those places where I saw that critical language and God has liberated me, like that's what intrigued me also partially, that Jews can have seemingly a more, what's the most respectful, critical language or critical relationship with God, what I felt was missing in Islam. In the last 200-300 years, with the decline of Muslim civilizations, with the static frozen state of Islamic thinking, I felt the overemphasis of not questioning the wisdom of God, swallowing your questions, being in constant devotion. Sometimes it leads to somewhat more numb, more static, more frozen way of engaging with the divine. And I think it prevents you seeing the whole picture, which I found some of the critical wrestling language around God in the Jewish tradition could be an incredible helpful set of tools that Islam can utilize.
So I think, Abdullah, this is partly why our spiritual friendship really has deepened over the years, is that we each see in the other's tradition, and I certainly see this in you personally, an aspect that I feel we very much need in Judaism. And you know, where this plays out most powerfully for me is in the different versions in the Torah and the Quran of Abraham's argument with God about Sodom. And in the Torah, Abraham is not only arguing with God, he's haggling. It's as if they're in the market. And God is encouraging this, or at the very least indulging Abraham. And there is very much a sense in the Jewish understanding of what's happening here that God is pleased that Abraham is taking moral responsibility, even to the point of challenging God's decision. Now, in the Quran, of course, it plays out very differently. Ibrahim actually begins arguing with God over
Very
Sodom.
respectfully.
Respectfully.
No haggling.
Yeah, and then God, of course, immediately shuts him down. I'm God, you're not, and basically shut up. And Ibrahim does. And the truth is that I love both of those versions of the story. I revere the Hebraic Avraham Avinu, our father Avraham, as we call him, with really great love, who has such deep compassion over humanity that he will challenge God. Although, of course, the question then is, where was he when God told him, go kill your son? Why did he have more compassion over it? But that's the whole other question. And then I so much resonate with the humility of the Muslim Ibrahim, the Quranic Ibrahim, who says, well, yeah, really, what do I know? God is, you're right, you're God, I'm not. What's there to argue about? How can I possibly imagine bridging the abyss and holding you to account for what you do with your own creation? And so I feel the need to bring both of those sides of Abraham into conversation with each other, which is one reason why I feel we so much need a resurrection of the Muslim-Jewish conversation, which, as we know, did happen at least intermittently throughout in different parts of our history. There's something, Abdullah, though, that I want to pick up on about when you were talking about your visit to Auschwitz, your pilgrimage to Auschwitz. And that is that there's another aspect of how Jews relate to God, or I'll speak for myself. And this may sound very strange, but one of the reasons that I came to believe in God is because of the Holocaust. And when I say that to fellow Jews, there's embarrassed silence and, you know, taxi, let's move on to
Let me call my Uber. Let me call my Uber if it's not Shabbat.
I didn't realize I had a dinner date. I'm sorry. and what I mean by that is that I was deeply impacted by survivors who came out of the Shoah with their sense of faith intact, or bruised, but still insisting that the materialistic way of looking at the universe, the notion that this is an empty, chaotic universe, is untenable, precisely because that was the universe that the Nazis believed in. And I remember at a very early age thinking, which idea of existence am I going to commit myself to? The Jewish idea or the Nazi idea? The Jewish idea insists on a world of meaning, that the world was created, that we are creatures, there is a creator, there's a plan, there's a destiny. And the Nazi idea was that's all nonsense. And one of the purposes of the Holocaust was to play out the Nazi vision, to prove that the invisible God is not just invisible, but non-existent. And so my response to Shoah was to affirm the Jewish notion of existence as a world of meaning. And I remember there was a photograph, maybe you know this photograph, Abdullah. It's a very famous Holocaust image of a group of Nazis gathering around a Jew, and he's putting on tefillin, and they're about to shoot him, and there are bodies at his feet, and the bodies are covered in prayer shawls. And you look at their laughing faces, and you look at him in his last moments of prayer. One of the most extraordinary religious images that I know. If we had icons in Judaism, it would be an icon. And I looked at that image, and I thought, who do I believe? Whose idea of reality am I going to commit my life to? And that image really changed my life. And so there is something in how Jews relate to God, which is very much through history. We get angry at God because of history. We stop believing in God because of history. And some of us, curmudgeons, actually affirm our belief in God, not just despite history, but because of history. Mm-hmm. And we have a term for it, which in Hebrew is Netzach Yisrael, which is the eternity of Israel, which can mean God. The eternity of Israel is the God of Israel, but it can also mean the people of Israel. And many Jews today draw their faith in God based on the unlikely survival and even thriving of the Jewish people. Now, this is something that I know doesn't exist in Islam, this notion of looking at history or looking at even at the Ummah and thinking, well, God is being affirmed or denied through whatever happens to the Ummah. But that's very much a part of the Jewish experience. But the question I wanted to ask you, Abdullah, is you've spoken when we've shared our experiences about in Islam and Judaism with each other. You've spoken to me very movingly about what Shabbat means to you, what some of the holidays, the experiences, but really especially Shabbat has been very powerful for you. My question is, in a Jewish space, in a Jewish religious space, or in Shabbat, is there an aspect, a quality of God's presence that you feel specifically there?
Many. Before I answer your question, this this aspect of God, experiencing God through historical experiences, very unique. Something that Islam can and Muslim communities can learn and enrich from. What I really feel in the religious spaces, especially Shabbat, which is my greatest holy envy of the Jewish things that I have the envious of. I think I adore Shabbat more than many Jews I know. I wish more Jews would appreciate the Shabbat. What is most I appreciate is the world's strongest, most influential most impactful religion, capitalism today, is saying do more, consume more, become more, have more, travel more, like all sorts of do's. And then here's a religion refined and crystallized a beautiful language for the last couple of thousand years. For once a week, don't do that. Don't, that unique, crystallized, beautiful, succinct, and rich Jewish language around slowing down, stopping your external journeys, and starting your internal journeys, which are 5 daily prayers, which Ramadan, all of these are supposed to do. I have that aspect or element in my tradition, but somehow out of habit, negligence, it's just not making that same impact. I think Jews have improved this craft to the maximum, to most beautiful way through Shabbat, that you have to slow down. You have to center yourself every once in a while. You have to recalibrate your life. You have to check and examine your set of priorities and rank what's important. You have to go through this spiritual maintenance regularly. I think this is at best improved. The best spiritual technology is what I see in Shabbat. I hope that answers your question. And let's have few questions from the audience as well. That's what Raquel is pointing out.
I think a lot of us feel that we'd love to just let you keep talking. And I'm so moved by the connection between your hearts and minds. I've been doing a lot of this work for many years, if even a bunch of decades. And I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation as well, and that's because I think both of you have gone through your own journeys, but you're also able to be so honest about who you are in this conversation. So I am going to take the liberty as the moderator to ask the first question, and then I've gathered the questions from the audience. And given the honesty and the journeys, I want to push a little bit on how Islamic and Jewish conceptions of God can help each other. I too was very struck when I first started doing intensive engagement with Islam and Muslim traditions by how comfortable Muslims are about talking about God, about having God in the room, in the way that mono-Jews, as Yossi described so eloquently, we've lost it. We've lost a lot of that comfort and the presence. And so we've been listening to the way you have identified elements in the other traditions' conceptions of God, and how you have mined them and taken from them. But we know that that's quite rare. And so I want to come back to the image you used, Abdullah, about the mirror, and that the work of doing real deep encounter is to hold up a mirror. And I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about how does that work? How can Muslim understanding, conceptions, and comfort with God, how can that help Jews? And does that mean that Jews who say, as you quickly said, I don't understand how Jews who, say they're religious, but they don't believe in God, let's not even go there. I want you to go there. I want you to help us connect these ideas of how to have this conversation with Jews who want to keep God outside, and Jews who are more open.
Well, a set of wonderful, wonderful questions. But the issue of mirror is an incredibly important one, because these days I experience God, I find God, I am enveloped with the pleasures of God's presence, not in uniquely Muslim spaces, more often in these successful cross-faith conversations, in meaningful cross-faith and cross-cultural conversations, especially with my Jewish brothers and sisters. I gave already one example about Shabbat, seeing how beautiful it is, how much it brings closer to me to God. I went back to Islam and looked at the Shabbat elements, Shabbat materials, Shabbat DNAs that I need to reactivate, re-emphasize, polish, and improve in my tradition, in spiritual disciplines that I have practiced. At some point, it happens. I have seen this over and over, especially between davening, practicing religious Jews and Muslims. At some point in the experience and in the connection of your Jewish brothers and sisters to God, you see yourself, you see your connection, you reevaluate your own relationship with God Almighty. I think one of the most difficult thing for a lot of Muslims to understand about Judaism, this is a major mental block, and that requires a lot of help from our Jewish brothers and sisters, that Jews, Muslims somewhat have an easier time in understanding and even appreciating Judaism as a faith tradition, as a religion. Especially if they are religious Muslims, they can really understand the religious language. It's amazing. I have seen this over and over. Like if you tell Zionism as a secular political ideology, the conversation dies down in minute 2 or minute 3. It doesn't go anywhere. But if you say there is also a religious Zionism, there's a Zionism that's born out of, Zionism is one of the most toxic maybe word in the Muslim circles, as you know. This is something that Muslims sort of made up their mind and would never understand. But I have seen this over, even on something that they feel so allergic to, so conditioned and biased to. But if you tell them there is a version or a kind of Zionism born out of Sinai, there's a biblical Zionism, there is a religious fulfillment, there's an experiencing of God in that Zionist narrative. I have seen this over and over, how it drops immediately. So Muslims have a much easier time, even in the most difficult issues and subjects, to understand, respect, relate to Judaism as a religion. Where a lot of us, because it's so different than ours, is having a difficulty is understanding Jews as people, Jews as peoplehood. How can something be both your religious identity as well as your ethnic and racial identity? Like I am a Muslim Turk. When I think of my Turkishness, I don't relate to my Islam, and vice versa. But that reality is somewhat combined in the Jewish tradition, and for many Muslims, it's very difficult to untangle it. And one of the greatest contribution of the Muslim Leadership Initiative and the Hartman education to the people that I brought there is giving them the intellectual, spiritual, historical, theological background to understand how this is a simultaneous, united, inseparable aspect of what does it mean to be a Jew, both as a religion as well as a peoplehood. Yossi?
Yeah, I'm going to play Muslim here, and say that ordinarily I'm very happy to have that conversation about peoplehood. I am so much cherishing this conversation that you and I are having about God, but I want us to bring us back to the spareness of the Islamic relationship with God, and this is what I so love. Think about the mosque, and of course there are beautiful mosques, but even beautiful mosques are spare. I mean, when you and I went to Istanbul together, you took me to all these magnificent mosques. There's still something where you feel the spareness of God, the expansiveness of God, the clarity. And again, and I love my people, I love my religion, I love Shabbat, I love all of that, Abdullah. But there is in contemporary Judaism too much clutter and too much noise, too many halachot, too much social justice, too much Zionism, too much peoplehood, too much of everything. And I'm connected to all those facets of Judaism, but we tend to obscure the clarity and the spareness of God's presence. That's what I love and connect.
It is true. It is true. But let me pull a Jew on you then. That clutter, that lack of language around God is not because Judaism doesn't have it, but Jews lost it. Some Jews lost it. And I hope one of the many wonderful eventual outcome of meaningful relationship between Jews and Muslims would to help each other, how to reactivate. You know, I lose myself in those Shabbat services because the language of God. Because when I read the English translation of those, that language that God release my tongue, untie the tide in my tongue so I can praise you more. Shiru Adonai Shir Chadash, that I can sing you in many different melodies, in many different ways. This is nothing but a beautiful way of connecting to God that I have never heard before. Such a rich language of engaging with God. It's already there, but for all sorts of reasons in some Jewish communities, that language or connection to that what's existent, it seemed to be lost, that I would love to reconnect.
And it's interesting because what I think you and I have just played out is what we've each received from these journeys into each other's faiths, which is a renewed appreciation for what we have. We remind each other of what we have. And it's very easy to be frustrated with the limitations of one's own faith tradition. We're so intimate with it that we see it in all of its complications. And we can sometimes idealize the other. And you and I remind each other, well, not so fast. You don't know the blemishes on my side, and here's the beauty on your side. And that's really what a spiritual friendship should be about.
Beautiful, beautifully said. And as people who are committed to our faith traditions and communities, sometimes we don't see the unintended eventual consequences of something that you feel so wonderful and shiny on your side. That contentment, comfort around God, it has consequences. It ends a conversation. It sucks too much oxygen sometimes. That I want to see if I can do better in terms of gender norms in Islam. I want to see if I can make Muslim spaces a little bit more woman friendly. And some of the languages immediately shut the conversation. And if you trace it back, it goes to that I only talk about God in certain language. That if it all goes to that uncritical, sometimes issues that numbs our courage. I was just reading Rabbi Nachman's take on yes in pessimism and hopelessness. In Islam, hopelessness is equated to disbelief in God. And Rabbi Nachman says there is no greater sin than hopelessness. And if you read it, it's amazing. Still, there is love, adoration to God. But there's also space to engage with that concept of divine in a much more critical and courageous way.
I'm going to step in because I want to make sure that we address some of these questions. And I want to frame the first question just a bit because one might think it's getting off topic, but I think it isn't. And that is taking the image that's very potent in both traditions and trying to understand, is it the same idea, or does it help refract differences about the ways in which these Jewish and Islamic traditions think about the God-human-being relationship? When I was a child, I was told that on the night of Shavuot, the sky opens and you can ask for anything. And I remember sitting there waiting. I decided I was going to wait all night long so I could see the sky open, and I'm very curious to see what would I see when the sky opened. For me, going back to what Yossi said, it was very historical. I was getting ready to see Abraham Lincoln. That's what I was expecting. And later, many Gilgulim rounds later in life, in my own academic research on Islamic devotional practices, I encountered a number of prayers that were of questionable legal status, but they were all ways of leapfrogging over this clutter the normative daily practices to have this spiritual championship in order to get to that point where the sky opens and my greatest wishes can come true, whether it is Salat al-Nisf Sha'ban or Salat al-Raghaib. These are all have become very esoteric practices, but in pre-modern Islam were more popular than the Ramadan night prayers that we're having now. Are these the same? Is it the same? Is it in both cases an attempt for ordinary people, not the high scholars, to gain access, to have an intimate encounter, to leapfrog over the clutter, or are these different images?
So first of all, Raquel, I actually had a very similar experience when I was a boy. I was told the same thing in Shiva, and I tried to stay up, see the sky open on Shavuot night. Unlike you, I did not last all night, so I don't know if the sky actually opened or not, because I might have missed it. But
not even once?
But say it again.
Not even once you could pull up all-nighter?
No, I could do it now, but I couldn't do it then. But it's interesting. It's an interesting question, Raquel. And look, I think that what's true in Judaism is true in Islam, which is there is no one version of Judaism or one version of Islam. There's the religion of the philosophers, the rationalists. There's the religion of the mystics. It's a very different paths. And what really has long pulled me is the Judaism of the mystical tradition, the Kabbalists, the Hasidic movement in its golden age, and so I found great resonance in the Sufi tradition, even though I think there are substantial differences in technique. Nevertheless, there's they're looking for the same experience ultimately, and which is to experience God beyond the mind. The other thing is, you asked Raquel about the experience of ordinary people. I think that religion really speaks to the two different kinds of people and offers people a different access to God or a different relationship with God. For ordinary people, I think the function of religion is to help people become better people, more moral people. Mm-hmm. And for, let's say, the saints of each religion, it is really the opportunity to become godlike, to take on the attributes of God, and in whose presence you can really feel the reality of God. And I have known not many people like that, but I have known a few. And those people also have changed my life, mostly, but not all, in Judaism. And so there is that sense, in both Judaism and Islam, and for that matter, in Christianity, in Hinduism, that there are different ways in which religion functions. And the last thing here that just to say in relation to that is that religion functions in two very opposing ways. One is it offers the human being a sense of comfort and reassurance and familiarity, traditions that your parents and grandparents did, sense of community. And then there's the mystical approach to religion, which is the exact opposite. And the purpose of mysticism is to create a relationship for you with God that is strange. You are in uncharted waters. And it is the very opposite of familiarity and reassurance. There is something deeply terrifying, exhilarating, but terrifying in the mystical encounter. And that is, I think, very true in all the great religions.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yossi, you gave me my Eid sermon topic. What you just, I am going to be doing on this. But going back to Raquel's question, is it the same? Are we talking about the same issue? Rumi, the famous Muslim mystic, has a beautiful line. Says, I am pointing out the sun, but the fools are lost on my finger. I think it's all the same. It's pointing out to the same reality, but the pointer, the indicator, the signs are so unique and different, and our failure as a humanity, getting lost in the uniqueness of those pointers, is preventing us seeing what's being pointed at, which is exactly what we are talking about. And I saw this coming out of Jerusalem this Ramadan. I wept when I saw that two medics, a Jewish one with a prayer shawl praying in front of an ambulance, and a Muslim one in the opposite direction on his prayer mat praying. I'm sure, I hope you have seen that picture. If not, you should. I wept because I immediately remember of Rumi. They may be pointing into different directions. They may look different. But if you ask them, are you worshiping the same God? Were you just praying, asking mercy and compassion of the same divine power? They would say yes, according to their public statements. That was a beautiful 21st century manifestation of that, pointing through different means, but pointing at the same divine, same Hashem, Allah.
Let's take, thank you both. Let's take question number 2 that I listed in the chat about afterlife. The person asked, can you both discuss how Jews and Muslims so differently view the concept of an afterlife? I have talked with good Muslim friends who cannot understand how I can wake up in the morning and make it through the day without believing there's another world to come.
But is that true? Is that true that Jews don't believe in the afterlife? I leave it to the Jews and it's fine if they don't. But that struggle that David is facing with his Muslim friends are very common, because Muslims, they answer most of their question, especially if they cannot answer them, that there is something that I don't see. There is a world to come that this will become clear to me. There's a beautiful saying of Prophet Muhammad saying, God's mercy is 100 units. God's love and mercy is 100 units. And God only used 1%, 1 unit of it in this world. 99% of the God's mercy and compassion will be in the world to come, in the Olam Haba. Therefore, they park most of these big questions to be fully answered in that part of, in that eternal life. And that's why when they come across somebody who believes in God, who's a somewhat religious person in Judaism, but somehow the life after that is irrelevant, they get completely confused.
So thank you, Abdullah, for defending the honor and integrity of Judaism. Judaism did not begin in 19th century Europe. There are thousands of years of non-rational, irrational, mystical, superstitious, non-superstitious, all different forms of Judaism. In Kabbalah, there are worlds upon worlds. The journey of the soul that passes through this world doesn't begin and end in this world. This world is one small way station. We continue on. We have continued. The journey of our soul was extensive before we got here. It continues into eternity, into the being of God. And so this notion that Judaism doesn't have a relationship with the world to come speaks very specifically about a very rationalist form of Western Judaism, which is what most Jews know today. But it certainly is not representative thousands of years of Jewish belief. And I should add that those notions never penetrated the Jews of the East. And certainly a majority of Israelis today trace their origins to the Jewish communities of the East. So this is really a Western Jewish, I would call it, problem, which is a narrowing of our understanding of reality in its broadest.
And my soul revolts. Whatever God intended to do with the children of Israel, whatever project this is, what kind of a light that ultimately this will become to all nations, I just cannot accept that it's all about this life, that this project has no light to spill over to the life to come. I don't know. My soul is having a hard time accepting it.
I imagine that we can continue this conversation for a very long time, and maybe we'll try to figure out how to get both of you together in a room, if Zoom or one day, please God, in real life.
Inshallah, be'ezrat Allah, as we say.
Inshallah, be'ezrat Allah.
So I want to take a moment to thank both of you for opening your hearts and minds, and for we're all wiser and richer for your generosity and sharing of your friendship.
Thank you so very much. It's a shameless, maybe self-promotion, but seeing Diana Lipton's beautiful face on Thursday, we will be having another conversation with Raquel on Jerusalem about time, the sanctity of time. If you are available, join us. I need no further encouragement to be with my brother, Holy Brother, and no need further encouragement to connect with the Holy Land, where my heart is. So let's do this as often as possible.
Ramadan Kareem, and my love to you, your family, and Raquel, thank you. Thank you for being such a gracious host, and and to all of you for
Toda Rabba, the one who established the peace in the high heavens may establish it here and utilize us in the making, inshallah. Thank you.
Inshallah. I want to bring our evening to a close by encouraging you to explore other events that we have on the National Library of Israel's wonderful platform in Hebrew called Ulam Kriya, Reading Room. And you can see the internet addresses in the chat, as well as the groundbreaking initiative. This event came out of Yossi and Abdullah's willingness to create an opportunity to talk about the core issues of Ramadan as part of Ramadan Nights from Jerusalem, which is the first year of hopefully of annual tradition of creating space during Ramadan to talk about Islam and Muslim culture and to have these kinds of conversations. So please go to the website for other lectures in the last week of Ramadan, and hopefully next year we'll do a reunion. I want to thank everyone. I thank the Hartman Institute for co-sponsoring this event, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of the day and good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.